My name is Dan Wagner. I know many of you, and it is my privilege and honor to introduce our speaker today, our sixth speaker in the series ICT4D, sponsored by the Provost, the Annenberg School of Communications, School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and the School of Education. Our speaker today is Professor Tim Unwin, who is Chief Executive Officer, CEO of the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization. He's also chair of the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission in the UK and UNESCO chair in ICT4D. And when I first met him, he was still a lowly professor of geography at the University of London at Royal Holloway. He also, and you can see this from the brief bio sketch that you have in front of you, was the head of Imfundo, a project that Joe Sun and I had the privilege of joining Tim on in work that we did jointly in West Africa. Back was, I guess, 6, 7, 8 years ago, something like that. 10 years ago. Now, I had asked him for his full CV for this introduction because I knew a bio sketch would just be the popular version of what he does. So I went and I looked in depth at his 36-page CV. And one reason why I was looking at that CV was Tim is not, is more than he appears. He has some very, very prominent positions now in the area of ICT, which is, of course, why he's with us in this presentation today. But he actually started out in geography, in a particular area of geography called the study of wine. And what do you call it, viniculture? Something like that. It's beyond my normal scope. But I noticed that he has in his bio sketch a reference to this in his well-known book, among those who know such things, Wine and Vine, which took an instantiation or a practicum aspect when he would take his students, he would regale me over a beer somewhere, of how he would go every summer to Bordeaux and the areas around southern France, taking students to better understand the geography of wine. Now you have to go through various transmutations, I suppose, to get him to be the head of the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization. And to do that, and how he did that, has been the subject of a great deal of conversations over time. But let me maybe fast forward to most recently. He did work, research and teaching in China. I have crossed paths many times with Tim in common areas around education, and his work with the World Education Forum, the famous Davos meetings that he has played a very special role in. And he's always been a person, both personally and professionally, who is very open-minded, very direct, and not afraid of making a critical remark. And given the title today, I will not be surprised if he makes a few critical remarks. So welcome, Tim, again to Penn. He's been here before, but I think we need to welcome him back.
Thanks very much, Dan, for that overly generous welcome. It's extraordinary that someone can talk so eloquently about wine when he doesn't actually like it very much. And maybe it's the beers in Kumasi or something like that. The answer to that question should be obvious by the picture. And I think in what I want to share with you tonight, and I'll try and keep this to 45 minutes, so we have half an hour for discussion. The pictures tell their own story, so you could follow it in terms of the pictures or listen to me as I try and share some ideas. This is not going to be a seminar about truth. I think when you get to my age, you begin to realize that truths tend to be constructed by each of us in the way we want to construct them. And so really, it's sharing some thoughts and reflections on my journey over the last 15 years. And in a nutshell, I think I came in late 90s as sort of passionate believer, probably far too instrumentalist, about how technology can make a huge difference positively to the lives of young people like this girl And is it her brother or her daughter in the back in Uganda? I then, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, went through a phase of thinking, absolutely not. ICTs are the worst things that could possibly happen to development. And I think I'm pretty much still there. So you all, I know, certainly from the seminar yesterday, all but one perhaps, of course they can make a difference positively. So I challenge that. And then I want to come to the sort of position where I am now, where I'm arrogant enough to believe that what we're trying to do at the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organisation is a way forward to try and resolve some of the tensions that I've been thinking about. But I should begin where I was a couple of weeks ago and send you greetings. I don't know if any medics here. This is the new medical faculty that you're helping to build at the University of Botswana in Gaborone. And they were very proud, and I happened to meet someone on the exchange scheme that you're doing there. Kind of impressive. So you can sort of give yourself a warm, glowing feeling that maybe actually you're doing some good in a rich diamond mining country. And also, I should note that, did I say something? No. That it's good to be back. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'd like sort of, I've got, this is did you want your Skype people coming online during my presentation? No, this is your machine. I apologize. Should we switch it off? It would probably be a good idea. Do you mind if we could unplug so no one can see it, but quit out of that. There we are. Yeah, but it's my slide, but it's your Skype. You weren't watching. You weren't watching. Oh dear. Okay, so obviously from one UNESCO chair, humbly to, yeah, this is great. Ignore. To okay, so from one UNESCO chair to another UNESCO chair, many congratulations. It's great that you have one of these chairs. It's actually pretty meaningless. It doesn't bring you any money. The idea of having a UNESCO chair is it's meant to attract lots of money. But, Dan, many congratulations. Congratulations to the university here for driving this initiative forward. And certainly, literacy and learning couldn't be in better hands. And it's really good to see the US having one of these chairs. Sorry I wasn't able to. Don't they look grumpy? I mean, it must have been something that the learned professor was saying when it was inaugurated. So it's a great pleasure to be back here. Let's move to now what I want to try and share with you. You're all from very different backgrounds, and we could have a long discussion between ICTD and ICT4D. But clearly, in understanding interests, we have to begin with thinking about what we really mean by development. And OLPC to airdrop laptops to the world's poorest children. This is development. This is how ICTs are going to transform the world. Isn't it fantastic? And you can see the kids with a little green box there, which, needless to say, doesn't last quite as long as many people think it should do. So I then want to digress a little bit historically and theoretically. I mentioned Jürgen Habermas yesterday, and on my journeys around sort of various parts of the world, and nobody seems to have heard him. Anybody here a great fan of knowledge and human interests and theory and praxis? Anybody heard of Jürgen Habermas? So you'll take something away now. Jürgen, German, yeah? Habermas. So you could go and read, because I've been hugely influential in my thinking, and I think has a lot to say on this. I want to say a little bit about ICTs for development and then come round to this question of in whose interests and ask, fundamentally, if development is about changing power relationships, can ICTs do that? I used to think they could. I'm now less certain. And how might we respond to that? So what is development? If you haven't asked that question, if you haven't thought about it, if you haven't understood what it means, there's no way you can come to any rational decision on what we understand by the interests in ICT4D. And already today I've had some fascinating conversations about, there's a university here in North America called Columbia or something like that, this Earth Institute, and It's pretty second-rate to pen, isn't it? And you're doing much more exciting things. But the leader, the glorious leader who we all bow down to, or some of us do, believes that development, if we just give poor countries a huge amount of extra aid, that will lift them out of poverty. It will put them on the bottom rung of a ladder, that development is somehow a ladder that everybody should follow in a particular path and a construct. But not only do individuals have different views about what development is, so do kind of governments, academics, private sector, civil society. And we actually all have interests in that. In this modern intellectualized world, actually academics need research grants to continue to do the work that they want to do. They have a particular interest in development. There isn't a pure, innocent perspective that any of us, even academics, have on this agenda. And this village in Malawi, might it not be much more developed in many ways than where we are right now? Or perhaps better still, in my own country. So let me just begin very briefly with what could be a large conversation, which is about how we understand development. And what do you think of when you see her? Where are we? What is she doing? Whose feet are walking by behind her? This was a photograph I took in Dublin, in Ireland. There must be a Dublin here in USA. We have to, so it's Texas, USA, or whatever, Paris, Texas, USA. This is Dublin, Ireland. And that looks, to me, a sad picture. She looks sad. 5 minutes later, I saw her running around, taking the money and smiling that she'd earned to the person who was controlling her and sending her off to do some more begging, looking sad. How do we understand development? The hegemonic model, as I all too crudely summarized with the stepladder views of certain eminent millennium development people, sees development as economic growth. And I think it is remarkable over the last 20 years how that view of development has come completely to dominate international thinking. And there is a belief that poverty really can be eliminated. And do you think it can? If it can, are ICTs something that are going to deliver on that? And it will be eliminated because we have an absolute model of poverty. It used to be $1 a day. If we put more into the economic system, we can lift people up. And of course, that will spread down and will enable everybody to rise out of poverty. I happen to think that's completely problematic, because the more you have in the system, the greater potential there is for inequality. Hence, poverty is much more about relative factors, the difference between the girl and the man in a suit with smart shoes on walking behind. And to grossly oversimplify, in recent years, particularly since the destruction of the Soviet Union, actually that economic growth model, so beloved of the Washington Consensus, has become intimately linked with democracy. And they've gone hand in hand in our rhetorics. That we have to have liberal democracy to enable the market to operate effectively, to enable economic growth, thus to eliminate poverty. But if you think about it, think about the parts of the world where we have greatest economic growth at the moment. Are they those that we like to see as being liberal democracies? Is China a liberal democracy? So it is a bit of a myth that democracy and growth go hand in hand. So I say that just to set in tension in our minds a view that development as economic growth is necessarily the most appropriate model. There are, of course, alternatives. I think the one that has reached perhaps greatest emphasis in the ICT4D literature of late is Sen's capabilities approach, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, that development is about the greater amount of individual freedom you have, the freedom to utilize your capabilities. There is social equity. There is the redistribution of wealth. My own country, the difference between the richest and the poorest is greater now than at any time since 1918. That is a scandal. That is an absolute scandal. We are becoming less developed. But of course, those who argue that Europe is a communist part of the world. You have an election coming up at the moment, and all of our leaders in Europe are described as sort of to the reddest tone of red. Quite extraordinary. So not everybody adheres to the view that this view of relative difference is worse. There's also development as political freedom. And I come back to so-called democracy. So-called democracy, because we all know democracy actually serves the interests of those in power, not the interests of the poorest and most marginalized people in our societies. So, the dominant model, economic growth, is problematic, but so too are these. We could debate Sen's approach at length. There's a paper I need to try and write sometimes, which is why it's wrong. But to put it simply, by focusing on the individual, I don't think Sen pays enough attention to the structural constraints that prevent that individual from fulfilling their potential. So different views of development, and obviously the case goes that for each view of development, there are particular interests that promote it and support it. So the question is really, who benefits from these different definitions of development? And the questions I want to get us thinking is, okay, who really benefits from the economic growth agenda? Is it in the interests of the poorest and most marginalized, or is it in the interests of global capital? Is it in the interests of Cisco, Microsoft, Intel, et cetera, or is it in the interests of this girl in an orphanage who is being persuaded to trust in God in Uganda? Surely, to goodness, we know only too well that trickle-down solutions do not work, and they, the rich are going to get richer. And again, a critique of Jeffrey Sachs. He argues very, very vehemently that the rich do not get richer at the expense of the poor, but both can develop together. I profoundly disagree with that naive assertion. If we think about freedoms and Sen's model, who is truly free and what does freedom mean? In much of the world, actually, freedom means the ability or the freedom to sell your labor power. Who benefits from the sale of that labor power? Who is going to benefit when that young woman grows up? What is she going to become? And we'll see some images later about that. And even then, in revolutionary change, in Libya, in Mali at the moment, do the poor really benefit from that? And I think answering that question is perhaps why I became an academic and why I now am involved much more practically. If we look at development in practice, so for those who don't believe that inequality is essential to most definitions of development, I love that map for various reasons, not least it comes from the CIA World Fact Book, and not least that it shows the USA. A Gini coefficient, for those who don't know, is, let's just say, a measure of inequality in a society. That China, of course, has very, very similar levels of inequality to the USA. The grey is also telling, because the grey is we don't have the data, but in much of Africa we have huge amounts of inequality, as we know. So inequality is at the heart of economic growth. That's the point I want to take away. And to emphasize it from my own continent, the rhetorics belie what many donor agencies are trying to do. My country wants to enable poorer countries to develop. Our development agenda, as is that here in USAID, is about enabling development to take place. But at the same time, the European Union, and this was 12 years ago now, but wants to be the most competitive, dynamic, knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustainable economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion. But note the key points in there. Europe is to be the most competitive. In other words, we don't want the poor countries of Africa to be better than we are. So there is a tension, there is a contradiction in our understandings of ICT4D. Europe wants to remain ahead. Is that development? Maybe it's development of Europe. I will illustrate this with some slides later. So it seems to me, with photographs from China, of the richness of China in Shenzhen to the poverty of China, you can see the stick behind the blind person with the crippled person in front pushing his trolley with all his possessions along the streets of Beijing. economic growth and inequality. How, I think, the fundamental question for development is how can we ensure that the benefits of economic growth are fairly distributed? And the question then becomes, how do ICTs contribute to that agenda? And we must also ask what we understand by fair. To me, development has always been a moral agenda. But towards the end of what I have to say in another 26 minutes, I will come back to that question and reflect on a fundamental issue that I don't yet have the answer to. Let me give the theoretical interlude. Jürgen Habermas down at the bottom right, the Frankfurt School in the 20th century developed a body of what was called critical theory that drew particularly heavily on Karl Marx and Freud. And I'm not going to go into this in huge detail, but essentially Habermas argued that there are different forms of science, each of which has a particular interest. And the point I want to raise by bringing this in is that Habermas has shown very, very clearly, I think, that power and technology go hand in hand. And that the use of positivist science, and I love the idea that there is a hermeneutic computer science, but maybe those of you who are computer scientists, we could talk about that later. But that much science concerned with explanation fundamentally supports the status quo. It doesn't change it. And if we are beginning to define development in terms of ideas such as emancipation, such as empowerment, we have to engage in a different kind of world. And building on that, I think there is much evidence to suggest that throughout history, technologies have been developed and used by those in power to maintain their positions of power. So the fundamental question becomes, of course, are ICTs any different? If we believe that ICTs can actually be transformatory, what is it that's different about them? And of course, people like Manuel Castells have argued we're in a new information age where some of these things are possible. I think, in my positive, naive youth of only 12 years ago, I think I believed that ICTs did have that potential, that ICTs were anarchic, that ICTs did enable new forms of social communication to take place, that change the balance of power, which is fundamental to development. There is so much literature about how mobile devices do just that, how the shift from a top-down dispersal media to a bottom-up collective media is a fundamental change. And maybe there was a time when technology was ahead of the law. Maybe there was a time when great creative thinkers and people in California who were developing new modes of interaction through technology. Maybe that existed. I think the world has changed. I think the world has changed hugely, particularly in the last 5 years. But maybe it's just my world and my way of thinking, because we have to ask who has the ultimate control. In my country, under the last government, there was a very, very serious move for all digital communications to be maintained, kept, studied by the state. GCHQ, which is our government-run tracking monitoring system, the government was trying very, very hard. So any email you sent, any VoIP you sent would be analyzed by them. Fortunately, that was thrown out. But who actually has the power? Do people? Or do companies such as Google? Would you prefer all of the data about you, all your bio data, to be owned by your governments, for those from abroad, or by a company? Every time I go through customs, all my fingerprints and my retinal scan go into the CIA's hands, and they could, I'm sure, put those on a glass in Guatemala. And because they're there, and it's technology, and it's hardly proved, I would be in Guatemala. I wouldn't be where I was. Who owns our data? And you know, to bring this to reality in my own country, there's a lot of argument that mobile phones were used to coordinate the violence that we had. And that actually mobile phones were anarchic. People against the state were able to use it. But of course, most of those people have now been through courts. Many are arrested and in jail. My country is the most surveilled country in the world. I set my students a task to actually see how the distance in a straight line from A to B and the distance they could go without being seen on a camera. And the last time I did this exercise, none of them could complete it because it was impossible to go from A to B without being seen on a camera. Who owns that information? We even have little, do you have little cars like this going around your streets with cameras on the top seeing what's happening here? Yes. I haven't seen them here, but they're increasing across London. You know, phone tapping is desperately easy. I just use those as illustrations, and we could get into talking about the so-called Arab Spring in discussions afterwards. But those working in ICT4D, in our field, I suggest, have to believe that ICTs can change societies for the better. You know, I'm sure we're familiar with all the imagery that came out of the so-called Facebook revolution. We have to believe that these technologies made a change. I don't know if any of you saw it, but I ran a debate at the ICTD 2012 conference in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago about whether or not mobiles, social media can indeed support a democracy. And it was remarkable that there was almost 50-50 break in that debate in terms of who was in favor and who was against. I think the balance of evidence is very much that ICTs may, at best, have amplified the changes. Facebook, mobile phones did not cause the changes that took place in North Africa. And there's a lot of really good empirical research that's now coming out to suggest that that is the case. How much of it hasn't yet been published. So this was the debate we had, and it's very encouraging to see academics beginning to demystify some of the things that were said. I've used this slide before, probably on a previous presentation here, but if we actually look at the technologies then and say, well, what is going on? Effectively, we can see, and I think these change around, but the point I want to make about that is we can distinguish between ICTs in lots of different ways. Individual or communal, the ease of use, and the cost. And it's remarkable that these things are called personal computers. They're not collective computers. So in whose interest is this technology? If we're really interested in supporting the poorest and the most marginalized, what kinds of technologies, what kinds of expense, what kinds of device should we be working on? And this leads me into thinking actually about what's happening in evolution of technology. All the curves tend to be quite positive. We see the explosion of mobile cellular subscriptions, and we say that's a good thing, that Africa has all these mobile devices. Surely that will contribute to development. It's quite interesting on this curve how some of the other lines haven't gone up quite as rapidly as one might expect. But is that a success story? Does that really contribute to development? Again, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with M-Pesa and the sending of money to your distant relatives just by mobile phones, or your use of your mobile phone to take money across one part of Nairobi to another so you don't get mugged and have the cash stolen on the way. Is that really a success story? Who is really benefiting from M-Pesa? Is the M-Pesa model one that transfers to other countries? Certainly in Tanzania, just across the border, equivalent models have not been anything like as successful. And it's often said that this is an African innovation that is now being exported to other parts of the world. How many people here use mobile banking, actually, just a matter of interest? 2 or 3. Why don't the rest of us? And how do we define success? For whom is M-Pesa really a success? Is it for this smiling mother of the migrant laborer in Nairobi? Or is it for other people. And you can see where I'm beginning to go. I think it is primarily other people. Let's drill down with mobile subscriptions. And this is the developed world, so the developed world, the world as a whole, and the developing world. And you know, interesting curves. That would suggest the developing world is beginning to do really well. It's beginning, it's still on the upward curve, while the developed world is declining. Implications of this for anyone involved in the mobile industry are absolutely huge, because you have two fundamentally different markets, two fundamentally different models. That is where everybody has one mobile phone. Now, how many people here have 2 or 3 mobile phones? Probably not many. Some of us do. But you have to be persuaded to get the next best thing. You know, not just the old iPhone, but the new iPhone. And maybe to have different kinds of mobile device, a media pad tablet that connects as well. That is the top end of the market. Of course, all our old devices can still be sold in the poorer countries of the world to fuel that increase in growth. Let's look at some different data, disaggregated in different ways. If you haven't read the ITU report last year on the least developed countries, do. Because there is now very, very good evidence that the least developed countries are not experiencing this growth at all. And it's not just the lines there and the gradients that are important. It's the difference. In other words, this is the developed world, the developing world, and the least developed countries in green. What worries me most about that is that the differences now are vastly greater than they were 10 years ago. So actually, if we're talking about ICT for development, developing the least developed countries, we're doing appallingly badly. The gaps are getting bigger. So ICTs, if we look, and you can look at almost any indices, and they show the same thing. They're leading to greater inequality rather than lessening them, and I put there at all scales. I showed you graphs for between countries. You could have exactly the same graphs for between urban and rural areas, between different groups of people. One of my PhD students has done some really interesting empirical work in Pakistan, where women's use of ICTs, particularly mobile phones, is dramatically less for a whole range of complex social reasons than their male counterparts. Those are just some examples. I hope from your own experiences you could replicate them and you would agree that ICTs are not decreasing inequality. They're rather increasing inequality. And if we define development in a relative way, that is worrying. So I move to say, why is this happening? And I think there are lots of suggestions. Firstly, we all recognize the hugely transformatory character of the power of these technologies. Some great things have undoubtedly happened. We can all cite examples of the way in which they have transformed our societies. But the point is, this has not been done explicitly and systematically in the interests of the poorest and most marginalized people. If it had been, would we not all have devices that are accessible to the blind and the deaf and the people without fingers? The market for those is small, so the price goes up. But we could... Is this yours? Doing working in the background. Okay, apologies. Just didn't want to destroy it. We're not doing these. We're not using technology in the way that we could to support the most marginalized. There is no doubt that this is driven by the interests of capital in expanding the markets and in reducing the costs of production or transaction. And I think, too, there is this search for a silver bullet, this belief amongst development practitioners and academics alike that there is an answer to development. And it really, really worries me that ICTs have been put in that little space, that ICTs are going to make a fundamental, because they've transformed other aspects of society. They are so powerful. We can use them for development. But I don't think they will. And it worries me more than just that, because it worries me in terms of the language and the rhetoric. Why do we call development, and why do we see development as a sort of fight for which bullets must be used in the first case? This is a direct quotation. You can find countless examples, and I have great admiration for Ken Banks and Kiwanja and others. But look at this headline: mobile phones help fight poverty. UN study. Surely poverty isn't a battle. Surely it shouldn't be about fighting. Surely we have to have a different language and an alternative vocabulary. Development isn't a fight. I don't think poverty can ever be eliminated. Go back to the girl on the street in Dublin. Poverty, to me, is relational. It's the differences. Poverty is about how we extend those differences or how we reduce them. We will never eliminate poverty just by increasing economic growth. Another aspect of this is we have to move away from single solutions. We have to understand the interests in development, and therefore the interests in ICT4D, and that is what I'm going to move to in a moment. We all have interests in development. Let's not forget that every academic working in this field has an interest. Their job depends on it. Bilateral donors have an interest in the control that it affects, in reducing poverty in parts of the world that could damage their economic growth. Leaders of, in inverted commas, poor countries have an interest in development in terms of bringing extra resources in. The private sector definitely has an interest in development. Civil society organizations across the world have an interest in development and in showing that there is poverty. So you will all give money. We will all give money to them to support that. We all have a complex set of interests in development. Another point I think that comes out of this is we must get rid of the term that is so beloved of people in ICT4D, that of best practices. There are no such things as best practices, because a best practice won't apply in another context. Let's please use good practices and then develop local specificity. Development, as I've said before, is a moral agenda, and it is one that is fundamentally about peace and not war. If I believed in war, I would have adopted the revolutionary stance when I was younger. If I could have killed people, that would be the move I would have taken. But that actually, I now realize, never leads to the elimination of poverty either. These ICTs that we have are hugely powerful. They've transformed the global financial system, so surely we can use them to prevent poverty. It could be argued that the openness and the freedoms around ICTs and what they can offer are indeed a way that can be used collectively, crowdsourcing, for example, to make a difference to power relationships. I think we're at very interesting times at the moment in terms of whether that battle will be won by one side or the other. Now, those who are wanting to keep the internet free and open are now being challenged by a two-speed internet. Tim Berners-Lee advocating, of course, very strongly that it should remain open. I reckon, I don't know, what do you reckon? In 3 years' time, there'll be a two-speed internet for the rich and powerful, and then a slower speed for everybody else? You know, what's happening in that political debate here? We like to think that crowdsourcing and the anarchic potential of the web and hacking are exciting and will change relationships. But actually, ultimately, individuals don't, not many individuals I know anyway, own tanks. It's states that have the power of coercion. Maybe a lot of people working together can begin to change that, but the lesson of North Africa is that that remains uncertain. So what do we do about this together? And let me move towards my conclusion. I've been trying to argue, and I will say much more about aspects of ICT in a moment, but that development has to be about more than economic growth. If we're going to talk about real ICT4D, we have to explore different mechanisms than just economic growth. Secondly, and it's something that I think I've only recently come to really think about and acknowledge, is when I gave a similar talk in London at the School of Oriental African Studies recently, and some of the young students there really had a go at me when I made this point in a slightly different way. But in the world in which we live, the real politics is that the market will take care of the majority. They were arguing that we have to constrain market forces. So we had quite a fun debate about this. But I think realistically, we need to think about how can we enable that market to function effectively for the majority of people. And that's why, and certainly in my previous work on this, I never placed enough emphasis on it. That's why the regulatory environment and managing regulatory issues is so critically important. If we do that, we can then say, okay, where does ICT4D, the second part, fit in? If the first part is enabling the market to function effectively, we can then begin to explore how we can use ICTs to support the needs of the poorest and the most marginalized people. And this was actually the work I was doing last year in China for 3 months. And you know, again, very happy to talk about some of the detail. But the interesting picture is the one, the particularly interesting one, is the top right there. Does anything strike you as particularly interesting about that? What are they doing? And I met them on actually the underground, the metro, the tube. They're deaf. And they're using a small digital device to communicate with each other. It was amazing. I've never seen that anywhere else in the world yet. Of course it's happening in China. And to move in that direction, I think we need to devise ways to design ICTs that are really going to deliver on the needs of the poorest. And you know, pulling together, particularly working in rural areas of China, these are pretty common sense. They're pretty straightforward. I don't think many people would quibble with them. But not enough emphasis is being placed on this. The future is something 7 inches and flexible that we'll all have in our pocket and costs almost nothing. The Indian government is developing Akash, this small notepad that they're going to give, according to the Minister of ICT and Human Resources, to every single university student for free. And when they've done that, they're going to give to every child in the country. And his vision, and he speaks very eloquently about it, despite the challenges that are obvious, that will then go to every family, and that will be the platform through which all Indian government relationships with individuals, citizens of the state, will be delivered. $35 a time. In whose interests, let me draw towards a conclusion, in whose interests are these mobile phones being used all across the networks of the Beijing underground? Of course, we all have interests in ICTs. I would never be as naive as to suggest it's just the interests of global capital that to the detriment of individuals. All of us as users, the social need for communication. Who would have thought 20 years ago that we'd all be spending our time on our little devices communicating with each other, rather than saying, it really was nice the way you came up to me and chatted. Yeah, you didn't send me an email this evening. You know, the humanity of it. Time, we all say, we phone our relative in the village that would take 10 kilometers to walk. We could communicate immediately. But think of what else we'd have done on that walk on the way, rather than just sitting in our room and speaking. Email is surely the most destructive thing for creativity that there's ever been. Email is a conspiracy to stop us being creative. Anywhere, anytime, that's hugely valuable. These, though, a status symbol. Look at this very attractive young woman dressed in white and silver on the campus of a Chinese university with the latest new Samsung device. There's maybe also the anarchic potential of the web. We can get any information, and we could talk about the effects that that has on memories and things separately. But the point is that I could do more in the list. Individuals clearly have interests in this. Something that it'd be nice to have a question. I put this here because I don't know the answer to it. Most companies say our interests are shaping demand. I completely disagree. I think our demand is actually being shaped by the companies. So, but we do have interests. Capital has interests, and I was sitting in the airport on the way here and just seeing everybody hunched up over their laptops. And we've become appendages of these machines. You go into a library and you just see the way that people, their fingers are attached. And they're hunched. It's a wonderful picture. But of course, capital generically has interests. This technology is incredibly good at facilitating expansion of the market, faster circulation of capital. The 24/7 financial markets that weren't there when I was half the age I am now. They enable reduced labor costs, BPO, but they dehumanize labor. And I'd be happy to talk much more about that. Specifically in the ICT sector, of course, the expansion in the interests of economic growth, huge, huge new markets. Hardware, software, social media, there's a massive increase. And you have all these data from Gartmore and other consultancy companies that show if you invest in your ICT industry, you will have this percentage increase in your GDP. Yeah, true. And ICTs enhance enterprise, entrepreneurship. SMEs do hugely better if they invest in ICTs, even small and medium enterprises, even there's some fantastic research by Mark Levy and his team in India on small Indian entrepreneurs who they show use it effectively. So in capital's interest, but also in the state's interests. What is eGov all about? Probably actually about reducing the labor costs of government. The paperless office, integrated systems, look how much those cost. But e-government is also about greater control, as I showed in the pictures from my own country. And I touched on biodata. Who owns our identities now? Who owns our identities? One of the most significant things I think we're going to be seeing, and much more about it in the literature in 2 or 3 years' time, is the way in which ICTs have fundamentally changed the relationship between individuals and states. And one of the areas we're doing a lot of work in is in cybersecurity, broadly defined, not just the security of your systems, but the ethics and the morals behind that. The social contract has been changed, I think, in the relationships between citizens and the state. So let me conclude. And this is a graphic which is really about how our new strategic plan in the CTO is trying to respond to this, bringing together the various different interests and directing them in the interests of the poor and the marginalized so that we reduce those differences in the curves. I think in the past I would have said that one interest dominated. I think if we're going to have true development, however we choose to define it, it has to be about getting a balance in those interests. It has to be about the state, understanding the interests of capital, understanding the interests of users, understanding the interests of civil society. I've come to believe very strongly that we need to differentiate, as I've alluded earlier, between the market serving the needs of the majority and enabling that to happen efficiently and effectively, whilst at the same time ensuring that mechanisms exist whereby we intervene so as to enable the more marginalized, the less privileged, to benefit from the immense power of these technologies in the ways that they want to. That's why multi-stakeholder partnerships using ICTs, bringing together these different interests, are so important. But that is another lecture or another seminar, and Dan, in a couple of years' time, we could come back and have a rematch. I would just say here that because of those interests, we have to acknowledge them openly amongst ourselves. And in any partnership, it is transparency and trust that I think are most important. Finally, we have to challenge, as I hope I have done. Looking around, I'm not sure everybody is convinced, but we have to challenge an instrumentalist view of ICT for development. ICTs by themselves will change nothing for the better. ICTs will, I think, always be used by those in power to serve their own interests. ICTs can only be used to development if we have made that moral commitment in our own minds that the relationships within our societies need changing so that the poorest and the most marginalized can indeed benefit. I'll stop there. That is just over 45 minutes. I hope I've at the very least provoked some of you. I could say much more about actually what we intend to do about resolving those later. But let me leave it there. Thank you once again very much for inviting me. It's always brilliant to be here. It's nice to be at a university that I think still stands for some of the most important principles of the academy, which are about the pursuit of knowledge for its own interests. They're about collegiality and friendship. They're not about individual arrogance and success. It's about working together, and I think Penn has shown always that you have a commitment to working with people overseas to share the excellence that you have, and that's why I began with a slide of Gaborone, and also the fact that you have a UNESCO chair. So join me in thanking and congratulating Dan and others who've lit that candle and continue to burn it. Thank you, Dan.
I guess didn't expect the ending to be that way after the call to revolution. But I guess the floor is open for. I know that this provoked a lot of thoughts because I am familiar with the previous 5 speakers. In their own ways were provocative. I think this took us a different notch. And the floor is open. I think we're small enough. You can just address yourself, maybe identify yourself.
You can come closer. You could come closer.
They could if they fear. Come closer. Or you could come closer.
Now we can smell each other.
Huh? There's pizza outside, that's what you're smelling at.
That's why, we can't, even with the best Huawei or Cisco telepresence, it's not quite the same because we can't smell each other.
But soon you can. They're working on the technology.
Well, they've already got wine tasting across at distance points. You have something that senses the smell and then emits it the other end. So yes. Yeah. But hey, Joe, your smells.
Excellent odor. It's not even honey bottle that stuff, right? So,
yeah.
I just have a general question involving space. If you had any sense of...
Actually, can you identify? I happen to know who you are, but could you identify
So do I. But the others. Okay.
Yes, I'm Rodney Smith. I'm in the grad school of education, and my focus is international education development. My question is really about the breakdown of where funds are being allocated within the ICT for development space, because obviously we're looking at this from a practical in education and healthcare, servicing human needs. But at the top level, are you seeing a disproportionate allocation towards, for example, military-industrial complex, which you alluded to? So, how are we competing?
I think the world's changed. It is always evolving. Now, there was a time 10 years ago when I think quite a lot of bilateral donor funding was going into this space, particularly in the run-up and around WSIS. It's quite remarkable how that has stepped back. I think one of the reasons for that is the so-called like-minded donors have tended to, there are 2 reasons, lots, but 2 main ones. One is like-minded donors tended to move towards general budgetary support mechanisms, not funding projects. So they've said to a developing country government, yeah, we'll support your poverty reduction strategy process. If you want to use ICTs for health, then you use the money we're giving you for that. I think so I think that has detracted away from specific initiatives in ICT4D. So all the big donors who were in this space, by and large, have pulled out. And so lots of people who are applying for grants for ICT4D haven't got them. They have to go in other ways. I think, secondly, in inverted commas, Western donors have remarkably pulled out of, over recent years, funding infrastructure. If you actually look at the allocation of development resources to infrastructure, there's sort of been this thought that we shouldn't be funding DFID, where I used to work, would certainly be true. That's left a huge space for another big donor to move in, China. One of the most remarkable things about China is 10, 15 years ago, something like 95% of Chinese villages had electricity. If only all the aid that had gone into Africa in the last 50 years just enabled that to be the case in Africa. And now, talking with China Mobile last year, they said 98% of Chinese people have access to mobile telephony. You can't have ICTs unless you've got electricity. Look at how that's working. But this isn't happening in Africa. And it is actually now the Chinese who are putting in a lot of the fiber, doing a lot of the infrastructure. And the Chinese white paper on development, which was published almost exactly a year ago, they're actually really emphasizing infrastructure. So I think that's interesting. You touch about, the complex. I put that in and decided not to mention it specifically because I didn't want to offend anybody. But I'm a geographer by background, geographical information systems, all the explosion, to use a deliberate word, was of course to enable missiles to be targeted much more accurately on their intended targets. Exaggeration for the camera a little bit, but I don't think a lot. So your illusions that military is driving this, there's a lot of truth in. I actually, it'll come as a slight paradox to everything I said. I actually think that what we have to do is come up with really decent models to work with the business end of industry to deliver on these multi-stakeholder partnerships. I think that's actually possible. So we create the regulatory environment to enable capital to do its business and support the majority. We then craft these multi-stakeholder partnerships effectively, not with the CSR parts of companies, but actually with the business end, because they know how to deliver sustainable solutions. And it is possible to do. A whole area around universal service funds. There's a tremendous amount. If there's spare research capacity, do some research on how universal service funds can be used creatively to support proper development interventions. I could rabbit on for years, but I hope that's given some answers to your question. Okay, let's get off quickly. I thought it was pizza time. No, yes.
Sure, I've got one. My name's Abby Campbell. I'm in the Graduate School of Education, same program as Rodney,
Yep.
International Educational Development. You alluded and touched on, just briefly, you mentioned the Arab Spring, and you, I believe, had mentioned that technology was not as much of a factor in that as many people think.
Can I show you the video clip?
Can you explain some
Can
more?
I show you a video clip? I didn't persuade her to say that. Let's see if we can get this to work. This is the beginning of the debate that we had in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago. Well, it's part of the debate we had in Atlanta. My glasses. Sorry. Assistive technology. And this is the chief Washington correspondent for Al Jazeera. It was here. Wait. It's gone. Yes, it's there. Why is it not showing? Hang on. It was showing a minute ago.
Where's Katie? Technological determinism, absolutely. With you 100%. I always told start with a joke. I've got a social media joke. Mine goes to a doctor. Says, doctor, I'm addicted to Twitter. Doctor says, sorry, I don't follow you.
I'll just at the beginning.
Assuming social media is a democratizing force, takes the technological determinist position. So you're falling into Marshall McLuhan's idea that the medium is the message, and I would argue that's simply not the case. As Adam said, modern technology has always been at the forefront of the pursuit of change. He cited Martin Luther. Here in the United States, of course, they think the Postal Service, which was designed by Benjamin Franklin, played a role in helping to organise the early revolutionaries. And active defiance don't always need technology to drive them. If you go back to Poland and the rise of the Solidarity movement, when state TV broadcast their evening news, people would go for a walk, they would meet their friends, they would turn their back on state TV to say, we simply don't accept what the state is telling us anymore. And they even at one point turned their TVs onto their balconies.
Maybe this is going to take too long.
So the message was clear, we don't believe what you're telling us. And how did that get exchanged? Well, it got exchanged through social network.
Yeah, he goes on. Basically, I think there's a lot of, careful what I say here, there's a lot of research now being done that is showing that two or three things. One, that the origin, the origin actually of the social networks and the movement were not driven primarily by ICTs, but they were movements agreed in mosques, in cafes, in street corners. So actually, that was where, just at the social networking environment, the networks were being created. Yes, mobile phones and other things amplified that, but in origin it wasn't. I think it's absolutely true that it depends how you define poverty and all the rest of it, but the poorest people in these countries actually don't have mobile phones, they don't connect to Facebook. This was actually, it wasn't a mass social uprising, it was a particular group of people with a particular set of interests. And those were driven fundamentally by a lot of things, but by the increases, simple things like the increase in youth unemployment. I mean, there's a real irony that in Tunisia and Egypt were both the countries where the governments had explicit programs, partly funded by the West, to support ICT for education. So some of the most advanced. And so you had a population of young people, but who couldn't get jobs, who the system was against. So there was this energy that wanted to change things, which was caused not at all by ICTs. And I think, how do I put this carefully? I think there were certain prominent interests that wanted to show that certain individuals who belonged to certain companies who had a high profile, you know, that actually worked absolutely in their interests. So why Facebook and other software? And there are pictures I've got of sort of, you know, the old men sitting in front of, you know, all the graffiti with Facebook that you all know about. So for all those reasons, yes, it was and Alan goes on to argue that, of course, the technology enhanced the effect, but it was not driven by it, and so to call it a Facebook revolution or a Twitter revolution is very, very misleading, but it, of course, serves in its own purposes a certain set of interests. Now, a lot of that research hasn't been published, but I could give you the link. You should hear Alan is brilliant, and Adam as well. And the discussions we had by people who haven't published their research in this space but are really working on it, very exciting because it's sort of debunking what is, I think, a bit of a myth. That's not to say that the regimes were problematic and at all. It's just to say that the role of technology. And if you look at other countries, you look at Iran, you look at Burma, there are an awful lot of examples where people have tried through particular forms of media to change things and haven't. And there's this issue about, you know, who has the real power, and that I think is interesting. You know, to what extent can a mass of people using mobile phones actually overthrow tanks if the owner of those tanks doesn't want it to happen? And I think so. What's happening in Syria is interesting. And particularly that actually that there hasn't been a kind of Facebook revolution in Syria. Yes, there's huge value in using new media to get messages out. But if a regime isn't willing to be changed by the outside, is that really going to have any impact? It's a hugely complex. All I'm saying is that I don't think ICTs have been as powerful as many people would like to believe they have. So that's a bit of a long answer, but it's a very important question. Yes?
There perhaps could be a problem with the name of the field being ICT4D, that already in the name, you're already assuming that technology is almost like the silver bullet in the solution for development.
Good question, and Eric Hirschman, the White African, if you know Eric's blog and things, Eric wrote a very, and I love him, but I think he wrote a very mistaken blog post just on that issue, where he was effectively saying that it's top-down patronizing, external, but that's partly why I showed the picture of Dublin, and I kept referring to development in my own country. I don't think, well, firstly, I don't think it's just about us, technology with them. It's about all of us. I draw a distinction, and it may be too pedantic, between ICT and development and ICT4 development, and I use ICT4 development very, very specifically because it is how ICTs are embroiled in the whole development process. How can ICTs be used for a particular kind of development with a particular, and in one sense that is instrumentalist, but at the same time I use it to beg the question about what kind of development. I think if we say ICT and development, and certainly most of the people who use ICT and development, I would suggest, are more instrumentalist. They tend to be people who develop a great bit of kit and then say, God, this is wonderful, there's a problem there, I know all about it, I'll develop this kit, and then give it to people, and then they come back and say, why aren't you using it? And it doesn't actually deliver because it hasn't been based on the real needs of the people for whom it's intended. It's a great idea, but they're applying it. To an extent, I can see where you're coming from, but I think by using 4, you beg the question of what development is, and that's actually the most important part, and that's why I've spent so much time at the beginning on that.
I'm a sophomore in computer science. So you said that we should focus on decreasing the inequality and use technology for that. But then, like companies like Apple, they focus on the fact that there is so much of inequality. That if you have an Apple product, you're the elite. So what do you do about that? I mean, there are always going to be companies which focus.
Yeah, keep going. I'll show you what I do about it. Actually, I haven't got it with me. Right. And one answer is that, which isn't Apple. And the future is something like that is completely flexible. You can roll it up, you put it in your pocket. And I mentioned our cash, $35. This is a lot more than $35, but that's what the future is. In 5 years' time, none of us except real geeks are going to have laptops, let alone desktops. And you'll have an option. You can be chipped, or you can carry around something separate like this. And probably, most students will chip as they come into university. They'll download all the information they need for their degrees. And you'll be able to track where they are across campus. And a few of us old sort of boring farts will have something like this that we can still actually have that separates us from the system that controls us. And I have a clapped out little old Nokia that still works, and I use that most of where I travel, but I didn't bring it with me because I was traveling light.
So you think that in a few years, companies like Apple won't be able to make money on?
Part of the answer to that is the curve I showed about the top end of the market. There will always be a top end of the market. There'll always be the person who wants something really cool and that's a status symbol. And actually, one of my PhD students, David Hollow, did some really interesting work in parts of Africa. Hasn't published this particular bit, but he came very near to arguing that the main use of ICTs where he was working was as a status symbol rather than any functionality at all. So where I am is saying we need to design kit that is going to serve the interests of the poorest, kit being software and everything as well, that's going to serve the interests of the poorest and most marginalized people. It's easy to do. may not be a lot of money in it for aspiring young computer scientists, but if you want to change the world, that's where to focus your attention. Yeah.
Steve Richardson. I am an accepted student in the GSE International Education Development Program in fall 2012. I'm just visiting. Enjoyed your lecture, and I had a question. You speak a lot about how the ICT4Ds increase inequalities. Is there any one example you can give us that did not increase it as much that you could highlight, and why it maybe actually helped in some sort of capacity in your own experience?
Go on, you answer that.
Well, gramming phone. What do you think of gramming phone?
I think gramming phone is quite a good example. There's beginning to be a lot of very critical literature on the gramming phone project, which shows it's actually increased inequalities in the villages where it's happened. So it depends at the scale. It depends at the scale and how you measure it. So
You know gramming phone?
Huh?
Do you know about gramming phone?
No.
right, it's essentially it's linked to provide microfinancing opportunities and provision. It came out of microfinancing ideas originally. Okay. So provision, a woman would in a village would be able to have a phone, and she could then use that for other people, so she could generate an income from the other people's. And it put very simply, there's a lot of. It's really interesting because there is a literature now about the whole microfinancing model being hugely problematic because people are just recycling loans and are getting into more and more debt. So microfinancing hasn't actually served their interests in the way that people necessarily thought. I think in some cases it has, but you need to get the context right. And with phones, yes, it's been a vehicle to enable telephony in the village. But again, it does come down to the scale and who is actually benefiting. I think there is some work now in India which is showing the way in which migrant labour, so the poorest people are not farmers. So all this work that's done in using ICT to support farmers and market prices and things isn't necessarily going to affect the poorest people. But there are bigger issues around there that we could talk about as well. But migrant labour are some of the really poorest of the poor. And the way in which they're using mobile phones to find jobs is exciting, and I think I would also answer that in social terms, because again, going simply with migrant labour, one of the most interesting things about my work in China last year was we tend to think about rural areas as being uniform, and so I was interviewing on focus groups with lots of different rural groups, all of whom had very different interests, so it's not a question of one size fitting all. So for the male migrant labour, do you know what the most important use of the mobile phone was? Sorry? Nope. Nope. Yes. They wanted to find where the girls were. And it's a social function, absolutely crucial. So yeah, I think, and how we measure things like that in our kind of normal view of development, that's critically important to their lives. That's just as important as making a slightly higher income. And then for the people who set up a business in, get this right, there was a group of farmers who were buying cattle at one age. They developed a new way of basically giving them extra feed so they would fatten up, so they could sell them at a surplus and make money out of it that way after only a few months. And they needed to find out who had cattle to buy in the first instance really, really quickly, and then the market to sell it, so they could make they could bring them together just for this very short. It's about 3 or 4 months only. And so actually, they said without the mobile phone, the business they had they couldn't do it at all. So there are hugely complex. It's actually quite tough to identify, to answer the question, and it depends from where you're looking.
Sure. Thanks.
Yes, Professor Wang.
Well, maybe following on this last comment, and also saying why I think it's difficult for us ordinary mortals to respond to what is really a brilliant, vast canvas of stuff that you presented to us today. And I mean that in a positive sense.
Yeah, I'm now waiting for that.
Yeah.
I've died now.
The problem, as I see it, is that in some ways there are so many different pieces, and you have great examples, that if I'm trying to pare it down to where I think the problem is, in some sense, built around your very opening line, or one of your opening lines, which is to see ICTs as a silver bullet. You accurately, I think, portray many people's views of what technology is supposed to do, and implied under the umbrella ICT4D. However, and I think this is the hard point, I don't know how I can say this as well as I would like to. It seems to me, in some sense, that that's a straw man, that you use that as an argument when you actually know, in another version of conversation with you, that the idea that any technology is going to reduce inequalities is highly unlikely. Let me just give two examples. The wheel and the printing press. Both of those, if you had wheel, you could be a Roman chariot driver and conquer half the world. If you had the printing press, you could take over land rights of people who were less literate, and you could own stuff, and you could convince them that your religion was right as opposed to their religion. It is power. There's no question about that. But you wouldn't really want to take away from the world the wheel or the printing press or writing down stuff, because it has very positive general social value. So if I was going to go to what this young lady says, let's say, you know, whatever tools we're talking about today, I think it, in a way, it begs the question. I mean, of course, it's when I have my iPhone 4S with Siri, and you don't, I'm better than you because I have social status, because I can say, where's Tim's talk, and it will answer me that it's in the Annenberg School on the 5th floor. You know, it'll do stuff. But the question is, I mean, do I believe that that's going to reduce inequalities in the world? I don't believe that for a second. Do I think it's a good thing to have it? Yes. I think that the problem here is that we hold up, and it comes back to your point, how could we possibly imagine? I mean, it's a mistake, and this is where we are in full agreement, to believe that any particular technology is going to reduce gaps. It's very likely to increase gaps, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing to do, and that doesn't mean that it can't help improve society, depending on what it is. And if you come at it with this is where I'm ending, I'm sorry, this could go on for a while, but I will constrain myself to the end of the sentence. You know, depending on what your motivations are, and if your motivations are toward helping the poor, as many people are, I think, are similarly motivated in this room, then there are some technologies that suggest themselves more than others. So, you know, do we need stock market information in real time? Well, not everybody does. You may need to get on that pretty quick. As the senior professor, we need to know that stuff. But
yeah, okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And no, I clearly wasn't as eloquent as I was trying to be. I think there are lots of different ways of answering that. I'm glad we agree about technology and power. I did believe that there were things about this new technology that were fundamentally different. In a sense, this anywhere, anytime aspect of mobile telephony is hugely powerful. That I used to believe that it did have a chance to change things. I think the potential of the crowd and the anarchic potential of the internet is hugely powerful and might have had the potential actually to change relationships because of the multiplier effects. And so partly, as I said at the beginning, I think it is partly my journey that I used to think there was that potential, that there might be something about this particular setting. I the classic is the arguments are open source. Open source theoretically is about changing the complete relationships. The irony is that they write the documentation for the code so obscurely that nobody who's not an intimate geek fan can ever possibly understand or use it. And actually, despite all its potential, using Linux on my old Acer, is really tough going. So I really did believe. I think there are really interesting things, particularly around technology and the law, which is again another seminar. But technology change moves faster than the law can change, and that has huge implications for this field, because it can mean that technology will always be ahead of the law, and that's interesting and challenging. So I believed, help thou my unbelief, but and I think I was trying to, in one or two of those slides, talk about the potential. What I was actually trying to do is move away from that to say that we all have different interests, and different kind of sectors of society have different interests in this game of development and life. And I think it's possible to reconfigure those interests to create a fairer society. I think it's a moral position, but I think that if we're putting all of this effort into the top end, that is meaning our society is getting more unequal, and I don't think that's right. That's more.
I guess what you're saying. It seems to me like there is a definite convergence of our views.
Yep.
But at one point, it sounded like you were very hopeful, like many other people still are, and you're saying that it's sort of erroneous hope and too high hopes.
Yeah.
That we have to have a more balanced.
Yeah, to put me very crudely on the spot, the extreme position is ICT4D is purely in the interests of capital, and it will definitely not lead to poverty reduction, and therefore calling that ICT4D is a complete myth. I think the positive where I was going to is, and where I think we're more or less is recognizing it, that I'm actually now saying very clearly the market will take care of the majority. We've got to make sure that functions really, really well. We need to increase the majority as much as possible. But that's one form of ICT4D, and the counterbalance to it is we've got to develop initiatives, and again, another seminar is on partnerships. We have to develop initiatives that will specifically enable the poorest and the most marginalized also to benefit from these wonderful technologies. There's two different kinds of ICT4D.
I'm Bill Seamery. Sorry.
Yeah, he's been desperate to have his hand up, Joe. We can, let's go.
Please.
I'm Bill Seamery. I'm an outsider, not an outside agitator. At a small NGO called Developing Radio Partners, and we work with the poorest and the marginalized.
Yeah.
And
so you like my slide about radio and
Right. And radio, of course, is and mobile phones are the leading technology.
Yeah. Yep.
No one ever talks about radio, but it's. I talked about this at the World Bank, and they said we need to include radio and ICT in all of our things. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you for your challenging this conventional wisdom and all these things to make us think more deeply about development, and to talk about things like partnerships and ports of transparency and trust and so on. And this works out in just if I can give you just a couple short examples in terms of how radio works. There's a little station in rural Mozambique, Radio Dondo, and the people have the sense of ownership. It's our radio. Stations that come in outside, it's the radio, but this is our radio. And it has such trust that when there's a problem with the police or something, they come to the radio station to mediate it. It's like the town hall. And the radio was pointing out, there's no clinic here to test HIV. And they kept repeating this until it was a clinic. And over 80% of the men went to get tested, that kind of thing. Cholera was a huge problem in the community. And so once 200 people were dying of cholera a year. And so once they broadcast in 3 local languages, how you get cholera, how you prevent it, how you treat it, there are no more deaths from cholera, that kind of thing. there's a station in outside of Cape Town, Khayelitsha, and their mission statement is to improve the quality of the health of the community. They include not physical health and just that, but the cultural, education, and so on. So when I asked the manager what he felt his greatest success was, he said, we found out that there was a pending school strike. We brought the parties together and solved it. It had nothing to do with radio on air. It had to do with trust and their confidence in this institution to do that.
I completely agree. My counter to that is one that a very distinguished African lady leader in ICT4D put to me when I made a very similar case. And I still think she got it completely wrong, but she said to me, so Tim, you want us to remain poor. Why shouldn't we have the latest technology in the Apple and the iPhone? That wasn't at all what I was trying to say, but it really challenged me because she was so convinced I was wrong. And almost anything I said, say, yeah, but the reality is, and radio can make a huge difference, and particularly community radio with mobile phones and a brilliant PhD student, Uduaka Khan, who was, her PhD was on sustainable ICTs and sustainable communities in the Niger Delta. And she was arguing exactly what you were saying now in this day and age about the value of community radio and mobile connectivity. And so I'm with you, but we have to be very careful, particularly if we're middle-aged white males in making those arguments in an African context.
I'm really inspired by all the young people here and, working on these new ideas and technologies and so on. And it's always good to know that, it must be demand-driven as much as possible or, done properly. Just to reflect on radio, that it did start at a university, at the University of Wisconsin, where the physics professors were puttering around. And as a land-grant university, they had the motto, the boundaries of the state are the boundaries of campus are the boundaries of the state. Yeah. And so they saw it as an educational tool. Yeah. Radio started as an educational tool, not for commerce.
Yeah. Brilliant. Joe.
Yeah, so just reflecting on this idea that you stated earlier about let the market take care of the majority, and then split the difference in a way. And, some of the rest of us will work on looking at ICTs for the most vulnerable. So that gets me to thinking about, well, so what if the majority is the most vulnerable? Right? So there's this whole sort of thing in development circles about looking at the bottom of the computer. If you were a donor, if you're an investor in terms of social capital, where are you going to put your money? And there are a lot of these big ones out there. So they're saying, well, let's invigorate enterprise. Let's invigorate market, and let the market do its thing to benefit the majority. In a way, I would put what they're trying to do into your language. So how far does that go? I'm thinking like one example in Ghana you may recall, Meltwater, the company, the Norwegian company, put all their nonprofit dollars into developing this entrepreneurial school of technology. So they're sinking lots and lots of their money into growing generations of entrepreneurs who are trained to crank out new businesses, right? In a way that's supposed to help lift everybody up.
How's that going?
They're still going. First of
still
all,
putting a lot of money into it. Yeah.
Well, from my experience, there's a lot of entrepreneurs in the African context. It's just the system which is not allowing them to emerge, and that's also reflected in the large informal economy, in my mind.
Which in some ways, so you make sure the structures operate to enable that to function, which is part of what I was trying to say. I think the easy answer is the pyramid isn't shaped like a pyramid. It's more like a curve like that. And so I'm the multi-stakeholder partnerships for development are the market, well, actually, except in China, which is why one of the reasons I love China so much. But you're never going to get sufficient market size, ignoring China for the moment, for people with a particular disability. Because the market's just not big enough for that. You're never going to get a market to develop commercially script in an obscure language that's only spoken by 43.5 people. They work that one out. But China, of course, is where it is so interesting because it's so big that there is sufficient market size to do some really cool things. So the number of people with a particular disability, the market is big enough, perhaps, to enable that to happen. And so that's also part of the market serving the interests of the majority, enabling, because that's part of just the numbers game. You can do it. But I think, so part of the answer is that in any society there are those who fall through the cracks. And it's how can we enable everybody, it's a way of thinking, how can we enable everybody have the potential of this? Because this leads to differences. It goes back to Dan's point, that maybe it is always inevitable that technology, and there will always be an increase in difference. All my point is that development is about to me, and certainly not to people like Jeffrey Sachs or others who are quite happy to have the increase the increase in growth. It's just about bringing those closer together, and I think we have to focus on developing. In Ghana, and Ghana has a huge universal service fund that actually we're going to talk with them about how they might use that to support people with disabilities and the use of ICTs for that. And across Africa, actually, the amount of money in universal, that goes back to that universal service funds, there is a lot. And there's very little idea about how best to use that most effectively because what it's meant to do is it's meant to enable companies that want to benefit from the largely urban markets are taxed, so that tax is then used, and we need to develop creative solutions to deliver to rural areas. For the most marginal rural area, the valley hidden up in the back of beyond, or the nomad in the desert, how do we get the solution to them? The first mile, or what some people call the last mile solution, is an expensive solution. How do we deliver that in value for money? Or that's actually what states should be paying for. That we shouldn't have this low tax regime that is now mantra in the world.
Can I pursue this just a little bit more? I don't know if Deepti's here to shut me off. But I think this is a very crucial part of the conversation, where we are right now. And because, in a way, I think you ended, you went kind of full circle in your argument before, and we're back there again, around an approach that makes very good sense to me, which is let the majority be the majority, and let's then use, let's say, funds that might be generated by that commerce to focus on the poor. But in some ways, your argument has been, in your presentation today, partly saying that approaches to the poor really haven't worked. But you know from your own work and from other people's work that not everybody has focused on the majority. A lot of people, including people in this room, have tried to focus a lot of time and energy and money on the poor. The Universal Service Fund, or however those funds are generated, that's a good thing, but it doesn't answer the question of what to do if your focus is on the poor. So we still end up with the same
we need to
spot again.
I think a remarkably small amount of research to date has actually been based on understanding the needs of the poorest. I stand by that. I mean, and one of the most exciting things is that now an increasing amount of research really is beginning to have that as the starting point. And to me, that is really healthy. I'm not saying nobody has done, but if you look at most of the research in this field, it's not begun with understanding the needs of the poor.
I guess maybe my last, and again, this is, sort of at the heart of one of the problems here. Let's say that we agree that more focus is being made. I'm not sure that we know how to measure that. I should be taking your picture.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, I'll get out my iPhone, 5 megapixels.
Yeah.
I just had to tell that. It's so good. Yeah, I'm listening, Dan, honest.
He
It's
has
beautiful.
a lot of ways of
And it's so
distracting
nice.
older faculty from what they're going to say. Don't think I don't know that.
But the flash, I didn't get flash. Anyway, I'm listening now. Come on. Come on.
But I feel like, as somebody who has been working on this now for a couple of decades, ever since there's been an opportunity really to work on it, the beginning of this, that we always are in some ways overtaken by events. So, and those events are where the private sector focuses on majority efforts to sell product. So they develop iPhones or whatever it is, the internet, faster internet cafes, whatever it is. In a way, my question is, won't we always feel overtaken, even if you have a regulatory system, even if you're trying to pull out money to focus on the poor, at least based on the last 20 years, it seems as if we're overtaken by the events of the market. So anybody who developed an OLPC, and they had their own flaws, but they're totally wiped out by the next generation. Anybody?
No, OLPC was wiped out because it claimed to be education, and it was absolutely nothing to do with education.
Yeah, but in addition to that.
Sorry.
And probably, everything that.
I absolutely hear what you're saying. I think I haven't read in much of this literature such an explicit statement about the market and the alternative models. If I have, I should pay credit to the person who thought of that. I actually think there is a real, I'm naively positive still, that there is a remarkable potential because the market is getting tougher. And therefore, actually, these private sector companies, and talking to some of the CEOs, they really do have an interest in reaching the unreached. And they don't know how to do it because they have their fixed models. So we need to bring them together with civil society, with governments, with universities, with brilliant researchers who are not trying to develop something in their labs and apply it, but are actually interested in coming up. How do we bring good value for money, i.e. cheap, broadband connectivity to small island states in the Pacific? Fascinating challenge. Really, really difficult because the satellite is hugely expensive. Cable, actually taking it to a small population, there isn't the market size. How do we do that? And I think we have to think creatively and laterally, and there are lots of other sort of innovative solutions in other parts of the world that working together, we really can deliver on their needs. And the least developed countries are actually, if you almost like, the biggest market because they've got the most to go to get up to where we've got 100% saturation. So, I think some of the big companies get that and are excited by it and are willing to work with us to try and craft these partnerships that will provide solutions. Giving a company a challenge, and academics are brilliant at coming up with challenges. You give a company a challenge that they haven't thought about before, and they can invest in R&D and actually develop new solutions, which is a completely different word from some companies that still believe they've got a bit of kit or a bit of software or a bit of technology that they know is right and can transform education or health or whatever, and then try and roll that out, which will not work, will not be successful.
Well, this is a perfect place to end. I know that DT leads us to move on here. I think, we end on a positive note, and thank you again.